Hey everyone, welcome to part 29 of my Pokemon game series in Unity. So in this video, we'll make the NPCs walk and we can specify the pattern in which it should walk, right? So over here you can see this NPC is walking in a pattern and this one is walking in another pattern. So we'll implement that in this video. Special thanks to all my Patreons for making the series possible. By becoming a Patreon, you can support me in the making of the series and get access to some cool rewards like the complete project files of the series, which also contains some advanced features that are not covered here. So let's start the video. So let's look at how to make our NPCs walk. So for that, first let's review how we are making our player characters walk, right? So inside our player controller, inside handle update, we are checking for input and then calculating a target position to which the player should walk, and finally calling the move coroutine in order to make the player walk from one tile to another, right? So we need this behavior for all our characters like NPCs and trainers, and not just for the player character, right? So what I'll do is I'll move all such common behaviors into a separate script called character, so we'll be able to easily reuse those behaviors. Okay, so in Unity, inside scripts, inside our character folder, I'll create a new script called character. Let me open that up. Okay, so first I want to move our move coroutine to the character script, right? So I'll copy that and paste it inside my character script. And yeah, you can see we have lots of errors. We'll fix them one by one. So next, I also want to move this logic, that is the logic to calculate the target position and setting the parameters in animator and all that. So I want to move that into our move coroutine, right? So what I'll do is in the move coroutine, instead of taking the target position, I'll take a vector 2 called the move vector, right? And using this move vector, we can calculate our target position. So I'll copy all this logic inside my move function. Okay, so here instead of the input, we should use the move vector. So let me rename those. All right, so in our new move function, first we are setting the parameters of the animator, then we are calculating the target position, and then we are actually moving the character to the target position, right? So one more thing we have to check is we only want to move the character if that tile is walkable, right? So we also need to move the isWalkable function into our character script. So let's do that. Okay, and after calculating the target position, we only want to execute all this if the target position is a walkable tile, right? So if the tile is not walkable, then I'll call yield break in order to stop the coroutine. All right. So now inside our player controller, we won't do any of this. Instead, we'll reference the character script and call character.move. So first let's grab a reference to the character script. And in the handle update, if the input is not 0, then we don't have to run any of this. Instead, we'll just call character.move. Okay, so in order to call character.move, it has to be a public function, right? So let me change that to public. And let's call that. And for the move vector, I'll just pass our input, right? And since this is a coroutine, we have to put this inside start coroutine. Okay, so this is just doing the same thing as before, but now the move function is much more reusable. We can reuse it inside the NPC also. So now since we are not calling the move function inside the player controller, we can safely remove that. And we can also remove the isBlockable function, right? All those will be inside the character script. Okay, so right now we have lots of errors inside our character script. So let's actually fix them one by one. So the first error is that we don't have a reference to the animator. So let's actually grab a reference to that in the awake function. Okay, so that error is gone. So the next error is we don't have reference to the isMoving variable. So this variable is actually defined inside our player controller, and we are actually using it to check if the player is already moving, right? We don't want to move our player if the player is already moving. So instead of using a separate variable for this, what I'll do is I'll use the animator.isMoving parameter itself. Okay, so instead of setting isMoving to true, I'll set animator.isMoving to true. So before we start to move the character, we will set animator.isMoving to true. And once we are done moving the character to the target position, we will set it back to false, right? So now inside our player controller, instead of checking the isMoving variable, we need to check animator.isMoving variable. So here I'll change it to animator.isMoving. And we don't actually need this line. So let's remove that. So now we are not using the isMoving boolean variable anywhere. So we can safely remove that. All right. So that error is also fixed. So the next error is we don't have move speed inside the character, right? It's actually inside the player controller right now. So let me just move this variable into our character script. Okay, and that error should be fixed. All right, so the next error is we can't call the check for encounters function from the character script, right? Since it's actually defined inside our player controller. So we can actually move this into our character script. This is because this behavior is actually unique to our player, right? We don't want to check for encounters and start battle and all that when NPCs walk through the grass. So this is something that should only be called when character.move is called from the player controller script, right? We actually don't want to call check for encounters at the end of move function if it was called from the NPC controller, right? So to solve this, what I'll do is I'll take an action called OnMoveOver. So we actually need to import the system namespace in order to use action. And I'll take an action called OnMoveOver. And by default, let me set it to null. So it's not compulsory while calling this function. So now at the end of the move function, instead of calling check for encounters, I'll call OnMoveOver dot invoke. All right. Note that I'm using a null conditional operator. So in case if this is null, then we won't call it. All right. So now from the player controller, when calling character.move, we can actually pass the check for encounters function as the OnMoveOver action, right? So let's pass that. So now, once the player has moved from one tile to another, we will call the check for encounters function just like before, right? And we have done this in a very flexible way. So in the future, when we implement trainer characters, in here we can pass the action to start a trainer battle instead, right? So this function is really flexible. Okay, so let's fix the next error. So the next problem is we don't have reference to the layers since they are defined inside the player controller, right? So layers are something that we want to access from multiple scripts. So what I'll do is I'll move them to a separate script and access them using the singleton design pattern. So in our scripts, inside the gameplay folder, let's create a script called GameLayers. Okay. And I'll move all our layers from the player controller to the GameLayers script. Okay, I'll make this serialized field instead of public so that they are not exposed directly. Okay, and let's create properties to expose them. So I'll just use a lambda to return our solid objects layer. Okay, so let me create properties for the other layers too. All right, and finally we want to use the singleton pattern so that this script can easily be accessed from any other script. So I'll create a static instance of GameLayer. Okay, so instead of naming this property instance, I'll just name it as I so that the line of code to access this will be much small and neat. Okay, so in the awake function, I'll say I equal to this. So now in our character script, for the layer, we can pass game layers dot I dot solid layer. And similarly, let's also pass the interactable layer. Okay, so now we have fixed all the errors in the character script. So let's also replace the layer references inside the player controller. So I'll actually remove all these variables. And to access the layer, we'll use the game layers script, right? Okay, so we don't have any reference to the layers anymore. So next, I don't want to grab a reference to the animator directly from the player controller script, right? We are already grabbing a reference from the character script, so we can use that itself. So let me actually remove the animator reference. Okay, so there are lots of places that are using the animator. So what we'll do is we will expose the animator reference from the character script using a property. All right. So I'll create a property called animator. All right. And in the player controller, instead of using the animator directly, we'll say character dot animator. Okay, so let's replace that in all the other places. Okay, so the player controller is much more short and clean right now, and all the common behaviors of the characters are in the character script, right? So our code is much more modular right now, and we can reuse the character script on all our characters. Alright, so let's go to Unity, attach all these scripts, and test the game. So first I want to attach the GameLayers script. So I'll attach that to the game controller. Okay, and we need to assign all the layers, right? So let me assign them one by one. Okay, so next we want to add the character script onto our player. So let's add that. Okay, not the character animator script. We already have that. We want to add the character script, right? And let's set the move speed to 5. So now the player controller script will use the character script in order to move the character, right? So let's test if the player is moving correctly. Okay, our animation is not playing smoothly, so we need to fix that. Okay, so I paused the recording and did some debugging, and I realized that using animated.isMoving to check if the player is moving or not is not a good idea. So this is because when we set animated.isMoving to false, it will actually stop the current animation for a second before we play it again, right? So instead of using animated.isMoving, I'll create another property called isMoving in the character itself. Okay, and instead of setting this, I'll set isMoving to true before starting to move, and at the end we'll set isMoving to false, right? And I'll create a function called handleUpdate, and inside this function we'll set animator.isMoving to isMoving. Okay, so now in the player controller, instead of checking character.animator.isMoving, I'll check character.isMoving. Alright, and after this I'll call character.handleUpdate. Okay, so this is some extra work, but it'll help us to solve the issue. So let's try testing now. Okay, so now you can see that the animations are playing great smoothly. So now let's add the character script to the NPC and make it walk. So before adding the character script to the NPC, there is one thing that we need to do. In the case of the player, the move vector will always be between 1 and -1, right? Its x and y values will always be between 1 and -1. But in the case of NPC, the value can be much larger, right? We might want the NPC to move 4 or 5 number of tiles. So in that case, while setting the move x and move y of the animator, we have to clamp it between 1 and -1, right? So I'm just going to use mathf.clamp and make sure it's clamped between -1 and 1. Okay, we need to do the same for y. Okay, so now let's use the script to make our NPCs walk. So let me open up the NPC controller, and inside it, first I'll grab a reference to our character script. Okay, so to test things, let's make the character walk when the player interacts with the NPC instead of showing the dialogue, right? Okay, so in the interact, I'll call the coroutine character.move, and for the move vector, I'm going to pass a vector 2 of 0 and 2, right? So now if the player interacts with the NPC will walk upwards by 2 tiles. right? So let's assign the character and character animated scripts to the NPC. So first I'll assign the character script, and let's set the move speed as 5. And next let's assign the character animated script, and we need to assign all the sprites for the animation. So let me just log this and assign all those. So walk down is from 0 to 3. Walk right is from 4 to 7. Walk up is from 8 to 11. Okay, and finally walk left is from 12 to 15. Alright, so we assign all the sprites. So let's test the game. Okay, so if we go and interact with the NPC, you can see that it walk upwards, but it's not playing the animation, right? So if we go to our NPC controller script, in the update function, we should also call character.handleUpdate, right? Only then the animation will be played. So let's test that now. Okay, so you can see that the animations are being played now. So we were able to reuse our character script, and we made the NPC walk without doing much work in the NPC controller, right? And the best thing about this is the NPC will automatically check for collisions and all, since all that is handled inside the character script, right? So to test if the collisions are working, let's try making the NPC walk towards the left. So X is -2 right now, so it will walk 2 tiles towards its left, right? So let's test that. So if I interact with the NPC, it walks 2 tiles to the left, and I can do that again. And now it should not move, right? Because this house is over here. So now when I interact with the NPC, you can see that it doesn't move. Okay, so this is the main benefit of writing modular code. We can reuse most part of the logic. Okay, so let's revert back these changes. Obviously, we don't want the NPC to walk away when we try to talk to it. Okay, so next I want to make the NPC walk in a pattern that we specify. So below the NPC controller class, I'll create an enum called NPC state, and we'll have 2 states, idle and walking. Okay, so the NPC will be idle for some time, and then it'll start walking, and it'll do this in a pattern that we specify. Alright, so first let's try to implement a simple pattern. So let's say we want the NPC to walk right every 2 seconds. So first I'll create a float variable called idle timer, which will keep track of the time. And then let's actually create an instance of the NPC state enum. Okay, so initially I'll set the timer to 0. So now inside the update function, if the state is equal to idle, then first we'll increment the idle timer by time.delta time. And we want the NPC to move every 2 seconds, right? So I'll check if idle timer is greater than 2. And in that case, I'll call character.move coroutine. Okay, so for the move vector, I'll just pass new vector of 2, 0. So it should walk 2 tiles to the right. And I'll also reset the timer. Okay, so let's test this. So the NPC should move 2 tiles towards right every 2 seconds, right? So that's working correctly. So next, instead of moving in this simple pattern, we should be able to specify the pattern, right? So I'll create a new variable to store the pattern. So I'll make it a list of vector and I'll call it movement pattern. Okay, so we'll be able to set this from the inspector, and I also want to set the time between the pattern from the inspector, right? So I'll create a float for that. I'll call it time between pattern. So now in the update function, we can check if the idle timer is greater than time between patterns. And if that's the case, then we'll also check if any pattern was specified in our movement pattern list. So I'll check if the count is greater than 0, which means there is a pattern specified. And if that's the case, then instead of moving to the right, I'll just call another coroutine called walk. Okay, so let's create the walk coroutine over here. So at the start of this coroutine, I'll set the state to npc state dot walking, and at the end I'll set it to npc state dot idle. Okay, so in here we can call the character dot move coroutine, and for the move vector we can pass the current movement pattern, right? So I'll create an integer variable to store the current movement pattern. Okay, and initially I'll set it to 0, and in here for the move vector I'll pass movement pattern of current pattern, right? So since we are calling this inside a coroutine, I'll add yield return at the start. Okay, so once we're done with moving the character, we can increment the current pattern, right? So I'll say current pattern equal to current pattern plus 1. Okay, so when we reach the last pattern, we want to go back to the first pattern, right? So what I'll do is I'll add a mod, and I'll mod it by movement pattern dot count. Okay, so now the NPC should follow the pattern that we specified inside the movement pattern, right? So let's go to Unity and select NPC, and let's actually specify a pattern. So I'll change the size to 4. So first let's say we want the NPC to move right. So I'll set X to 2, and then I want it to move down. So I'll set Y to -2, and then towards its left. So I'll set the X as -2, and finally I'll set Y to 2, so it'll move up, right? And let me set the time between pattern as 3. So first it'll move to the right and then wait for 3 seconds, and then move down and wait for 3 seconds, and so on. So let's test if that's working. Okay, so you can see that after 3 seconds it starts moving, and it actually keeps moving in the pattern that we specify, right? And once this pattern is complete, it'll keep repeating. Okay, so let me show you an issue we have right now. So when I talk to the NPC, you can see that NPC can still walk, right? So we don't want that. So inside of our NPC controller, we don't want to run any of this if the dialog is currently open, right? So let's open our dialog manager script, and what I'll do is I'll create a property called is showing, Okay, so in the show dialog, I'll set that to true. And when we close the dialog, I'll set it to false. All right. So now in the NPC controller, in the update, if the dialog is currently being shown, so we can check that by dialog.instance.isShowing, then we'll just return, right? So none of this will be executed. So next I want to do one more thing. I want to make sure that we can only interact with the NPC when the NPC is in the idle state, right? We don't want to be able to talk to the NPC when it's walking. So in the interact function, I'll check if state equal to NPC state dot idle. So we'll only open the dialog if the NPC was in the idle state. All right, so let's test this now. Okay, let me go and talk to the NPC. All right, so you can see when the dialog is being opened, the NPC will not walk, and once the dialog is complete, you can see that it can walk again, right? So you can go ahead and try adding some more advanced patterns and try making different NPCs and all. All right, so there are some more issues that we need to fix, like if we talk to the NPC should face towards us, right? And another issue is if we stand between the NPC, it'll just walk through us. So I'll solve those in the next video, and I'll stop the video here. If you think this video is helpful, make sure to leave a like on the video and consider subscribing to my channel. That'll really help me a lot.